So let me ask you something before we get into any of this today. And I want you to actually sit with what I'm asking for a second before your brain starts trying to answer or move on. What are some of the names you're still carrying that were never yours to begin with? Some of you got named out loud, right? You've been called a failure, too much, too difficult, broken, unclean, outsider, dirty. Somebody said it directly to your face, or maybe they said it 100 times. Maybe they only had to say it once for it to stick and live in your brain rent free. And some names, though, some names that you might be carrying, that you're carrying, came quieter, more insidiously. You were called the responsible one, the fixer, the strong one, the peacemaker, the one who doesn't need help, the one who just survives, the one who is mature for their age. Those names rarely get spoken aloud. They just become the air you breathe, the assumptions baked into every room you walk into, until you stop noticing them entirely. Here's the thing, friends. If you carry a name long enough without questioning it, whether it actually fits you, you start wearing it like it was tailored for you. You stop asking who made it. You stop wondering whether it was even ever true. Friend, I am your host, Reverend Andrew Shipley, and this is the Mission Gathering Christian Church podcast. We are in our Rise Up series. You can join us in person on Sundays, or you can keep listening here. This is episode 3, and today we are going to a river in the middle of the night to watch a man fight for his right to be called something true. We're going to talk about where false names come from and what it costs to carry them in our lives, and what it actually looks like and feels like when something truer starts to take hold within us. This one gets personal, and I hope that's okay with you, but let's go. So in Genesis 32, there's a story about Jacob, right? Jacob is at the river Jabbok, and he's going to cross the river, but he sent his family, his kids, his servants, his animals, everything ahead of him, the entire operation. And he stayed alone on the far side in the dark. Think about that. That detail is doing a lot of work in the text. I think it's worth sitting with before we move past it. This isn't a call to isolation or to be outside of community, but there are some transformations. Hear me. There are some transformations, the story seems to be telling us, that simply cannot happen in a crowd. There are things that only surface when it's just you and the silence and whatever it is that's been waiting for you in the night. So Jacob's alone there with his guilt and his history, and then someone grabs him and they wrestle. Not like friendly wrestling, like struggling all night long with no revelation, no shortcut, no moment where the clouds part and everything becomes clear. Just struggle, body against body, until dawn starts to break. And I want to stay with that image for a moment because I think we've been sold a version of faith that is genuinely terrified of texts like this one, right? We want the highlight reel. We want the breakthrough testimony, the before and the after, the training montage that makes the transformation look like something you can get to quickly if you just want it badly enough. But the authors of the Bible keep handing us people who limp across the finish line, people who showed up and stayed in it, people who don't arrive anywhere worth arriving without having to struggle to get there. Now, Jacob's been struggling his whole life. The name Jacob in Hebrew, it's Yaakov, literally means heel grabber, right? The deceiver, the thief, the one who grasps at what wasn't his, the usurper. He came out of the womb already working the angle. And that reputation followed him for his entire life. But here's where I think the story gets interesting and where it starts to feel like less like ancient history and more like something that's actually speaking to you and me right now. Jacob didn't become Jacob in a vacuum, did he? Nobody does. You don't learn manipulation without a reason to learn it. You don't have to develop the need for control when the world feels safe and love feels reliable. You learn those things in households where affection feels conditional, in environments where the real you, the unperforming, unstrategizing you, keeps getting punished for just existing. The trauma psychologist Gabor Mate has written that many of the behaviors we label as dysfunctions in our society were actually at their origin intelligent adaptations, brilliant even. The child who learned to manage everyone's emotions so nobody exploded, that was smart. The teenager who figured out how to make themselves small or invisible or endlessly useful, that was survival. The problem isn't that those adaptations were wrong. The problem is that they don't automatically expire. What protected you at 9 years old can be absolutely something that can wreck your relationships at 35 because you're still running software that was written for a world that no longer exists. Jacob is a man who has spent his whole life housing an image of a world that told him love had to be seized, that it would never freely be given, that if you didn't grab for it, you'd end up with nothing. And in the dark night at that river, that image is finally going to be evicted. But it's not going to be painless. I want to zoom out for a moment, if you will, because the story of Jacob isn't just a story about one complicated man's personal psychology. It's a story about power, about who gets to assign names and what those names are designed to do. The Martinican psychiatrist and anti colonial theorist Frantz Fanon spent his career studying what happens to people when systems of oppression get so deeply internalized that they no longer need to be enforced from the outside. He called it the epidermalization of inferiority, the process by which the colonizer's verdict about you stops being something imposed and starts being something you carry. The colonizer doesn't need to be in the room anymore. You've already done the work for them. Here's a quote. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of the oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. That's from Frantz Fanon in his book, The Wretched of the Earth. Friends, that's not just a political observation. As importantly, as important as it is politically, right? It's a pastoral emergency, in my opinion, because it means the work of getting free isn't only about changing systems, as necessary as it is to do that. It's also about reclaiming the self that those systems tried to erase or diminish or flatten into something manageable. The Brazilian educator Paulo Freire made a similar argument when he wrote about the oppressed internalizing the image of the oppressor, adopting their guidelines as their own, and living by those guidelines even when the oppressor is nowhere in sight. He called that housing the oppressor within yourself, which is one of the more haunting images I've encountered in political theology. You've been freed from the external cage, but you're still pacing the same four walls because you've memorized the jailer's rules. And here's where this gets uncomfortable, and specifically the religious direction, right? Empire has always needed the church. Not because empire is particularly interested in the gospel. It isn't. It does not care about it. But because religion is extraordinarily good at making the current order of things feel natural, feel inevitable, even divinely ordained. Post-colonial theologian Kwok Pu Lan argues that most of Western theology is formed was formed inside of dominant cultures. Think about it, most of the Western theology that we learn in school, if you go to seminary school, or that we hear about from our places of worship, was formed within dominant cultures, which means it arrived already loaded, already carrying, in her words, imperializing structures embedded in the assumptions about who God is and who gets to speak for God and whose experience of the world counts as theological data. Palestinian liberation theologian Mitri Raheb puts even more directly. He writes it even more directly. He writes that the land of Palestine has been colonized using military hardware that gets justified by theological software. I want to borrow that image and expand it because empire doesn't only need military hardware. It needs identity hardware too. It needs you to believe the name that it gave you before it ever has to use force. It needs you to have already internalized your own smallness, your own unworthiness, your own place in the hierarchy, so that when the system moves against you, you half believe that you had it coming. The one who interprets assumes power. The one who dominates the story makes the story, literally creating history. That's from Mitri Reheb. So let me ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously. What was the theological software you were handed? Because whether you grew up in religion or didn't, you were handed some sort of meaning making identity software. Who wrote it? And when did they write it? And who did they write it in service of? Whose interests? What did it tell you about your own worth, your own belonging, your own body, your own access to God? And did you ever stop to ask whether that was actually true or whether it was just useful to the people who handed it to you? That last question is the decolonizing one. And it's not a question you ask once you answer it clearly, right? Like you don't just ask it once in your life and you've got the answer. It's a question you carry with you and you keep returning to for a long time. Now let's zoom back into the river. This wrestling match has been going on like all night, right? And the stranger, whoever this figure is, some people say it's God, some people say it's an angel. The text is pretty ambiguous about it. But it stops the match long enough. They stop the match long enough to ask one question. Not what have you built? Not what does your theology say? Or what's your track record? Or how have you performed against expectations? Just one question right at the center of this story, this incredible story. In the dark, when Jacob is his guard is completely down, he's exhausted. The stranger asks, "What is your name?" And Jacob has to say it out loud. Deceiver, heel grabber, the one who spent his whole life grasping and maneuvering and never quite trusting that anything would be given to him. He has to name the pattern. He has to say it out loud. He has to name it before it can be broken. I think that's worth sitting with, how that would have felt. Not as a triumphant confession, but as something much more exposed than that. Like finally admitting out loud to someone who's looking right at you the thing you've been managing and minimizing and working around your entire life. That's not humiliation, but it's not comfortable either. Fanon made the same argument from the other direction. He wrote that the first act of liberation is consciousness, that the colonized person must first see clearly the condition they're in before they can begin to move toward something different. You cannot simply heal what you refuse to name. Truth is never the obstacle, truth is the doorway. And the terrible mercy of this moment in this story is that Jacob doesn't get to skip it. He doesn't get to receive the new name without first surrendering the old one. Walter Brueggemann wrote about what he calls the prophetic task, right? The work of nurturing and evoking a consciousness and a perception that runs counter to what the dominant culture keeps insisting is the real, permanent, and inevitable. And I think that's exactly what this question does. God shows up at the Jabbok, not as the enforcer of the dominant story, not as the one who confirms all of Jacob's worst beliefs about himself, but as the one who refuses to let that story be the last word. The question itself is the prophetic act. It creates space, just enough space, for Jacob to say what he's been living so that it can finally be challenged. And I wonder what it would mean for some of us to have that same moment. Not dramatically, it doesn't have to be dramatic, but honestly, what have you been living under? What verdict have you quietly accepted about yourself, your worth, your place, your future? What did someone say to you? Or what did a system communicate to you through 1,000 small interactions that you filed away somewhere as probably being true? Because you can't cross into something new while pretending the weight you carry isn't there. The crossing requires naming. It requires putting that weight down. So he says his name. He speaks his shame. Then the grace hits, and it lands differently than you might expect. Your name shall no longer be Jacob. You will be called Israel, the one who struggles with God, or perhaps the one who lets God struggle with them. Scholars debate the exact translation, and honestly, I think the ambiguity is part of the point. Either way, notice what God doesn't do here. God doesn't erase the struggle. God does not say, well, now that you've confessed, we'll pretend that none of this happened. God reinterprets it. Jacob thought wrestling was evidence of his brokenness, proof that he was the kind of person who couldn't stop fighting even when it would be easier to just let go. But God says no. Staying in the fight is the thing. That's what I'm renaming. Brueggemann has a line that I keep coming back to. I think the world misses him already. He wrote, "The gospel is fiction when judged by the empire, but the empire is fiction when judged by the gospel." The empire's verdict on Jacob is manipulator, liability, damaged goods, someone to be managed, avoided, written off. The gospel's verdict is one through whom nations will be blessed. One of those is fiction. The question is, which story are you actually living inside? And whether you examined that choice recently. Now, maybe the story of Jacob getting a new name doesn't land for you. Maybe it feels too distant or too clean or too tied up, too mythological, too tied up in the particular complications of how you've related to this text. So let me offer three more witnesses because I think the pattern's important enough to see it from multiple angles, right? In Isaiah 43, the prophet speaks and addresses the people who've been exiled. People have been told told by every available external indicator that they are finished, they're done, that their God has been defeated, that they bet on the wrong side of history and lost. And the word that comes into that situation isn't a theology lesson or a program for recovery. It's something much more personal. The prophet writes, I have called you by name. You are mine. And that word mine is doing something really specific there. It's not possessive the way that empire is possessive, the way systems claim people as assets or liabilities. It's the language of belonging. You belong not because you earned it, not because you performed correctly, but because you were named before the performance ever entered the room. Then there's the story of Samuel, right? In 1 Samuel 3 that gives us Samuel who's this child, right? He's a child whose mom like gives him over to the tabernacle when he's like 5. And he keeps hearing his name called in the night, and he keeps misidentifying the voice. Keeps assuming that it's coming from Eli, the priest that he'd been given to, the authority figure, the ones whose voice he's been trained to respond to. And I find that detail so honest and recognizable. When you spent years under voices that are demanding or shaming or that only speak up when something's wrong, a voice that simply calls you into presence gently without an agenda just names you in the dark, that sounds suspicious. Maybe this resonates with you, but gentleness can feel like a trap when you've been conditioned to brace for impact. Samuel had to learn slowly and with help what a lot of us have to learn. The voice that's actually calling you doesn't humiliate you into showing up, it calls you by name. And then if we go to the gospel, there's the story of Zacchaeus, right? In Luke 19, a man who's made himself very tall, right, by collaborating with an occupying empire, and whose community has therefore given him a very specific set of names: traitor, sellout, sinner. He's up in a tree, literally trying to see Jesus from a safe distance. And before he says a single word, before he has a chance to explain himself or perform any kind of repentance, Jesus looks up and says his name: Zacchaeus, come down. Not, I know what you've done. Not, let's talk about the things you need to fix before we can have a real conversation. Just his name. Just an invitation to stop hiding and come closer. Pierre wrote about what he called the ontological vocation, the deep human calling to be named, truly, to name the world to exist as a subject rather than as an object in someone else's story. That's what's happening in that tree to Zacchaeus. That's what restoration looks like when it's working. But here's maybe the part of this Jacob story. Like, let's go back to Jacob, right? That I think we tend to skip past too quickly because it doesn't fit the shape we want the ending to have. Jacob leaves and crosses over the Jabbok with a new name, but he also leaves limping. The text says the stranger struck his hip socket and dislocated it during the wrestling. And that injury doesn't heal by sunrise. He's renamed. He's been blessed. Something genuinely transformative has happened. And he cannot walk right anymore. He moves through the rest of his life carrying the mark of that night. I love that the text doesn't clean this up because it's one of the most honest things in the whole story. Blessing did not make Jacob impressive, it marked him. He moved differently now. Not because he failed, but because he encountered something real. And real encounters leave traces. We built a version of Christianity in this culture that wants transformation to produce polished people. People who have moved cleanly from broken to fixed, from confused to certain, from wounded to healed in a way that is tidy and presentable. And the stories in the Bible keep giving us limping patriarchs and weeping prophets and a savior who carries the wounds of the cross right through to the resurrection. The limp is not evidence that the transformation didn't happen. Sometimes the limp is evidence that it did. Fanon, for all his ferocity, ultimately argued something similar, that liberation is not the erasure of what happened, but the construction of a new self that the old wound no longer controls. The wound may stay visible, the name changes. Both things are true, and you don't have to resolve the tension between them to move forward. So here's what I want to leave you with this week. 3 things. I want to say them slowly because I think that they're worth actually sitting with rather than just nodding at. The first is start noticing when those false names you were given activate. You know what I mean? That inner voice that fires up with your when you're behind, when you're too much, telling you you'll never change, you don't belong here. When you hear it, try not to immediately argue with it or shove it down. Just pause for a moment and ask, who was it that first taught me that name? When did I start accepting it as true? And whose interest did it serve that I believed it? That last question there will open things up for you. The second thing today, right? The second thing, practice the truer names, even when they feel awkward or unearned. This isn't about toxic positivity or papering over a real struggle with affirmations. It's about what Brueggemann calls energizing the prophetic work of making an alternative future actually imaginable to your nervous system, not just intellectually conceivable. Because, friend, you are beloved. You are becoming. You are worthy of rest. You are needed in community. Saying those things out loud to yourself until something in your body starts to believe them is something important because the dominant culture is not going to say them for you and you cannot wait for their permission. And the third is the one I feel most strongly about. So hear me. Be gentle with the limp. You may still walk tenderly for a while after something in you shifts. You may find yourself more sensitive than you expected, more grief-stricken, or more disoriented by the absence of the old familiar weight, even when you're glad it's gone. That's not evidence that you failed. That may be the most reliable evidence there is that you actually showed up to the thing that got you in the river, that you stayed until dawn, that something real happened. The night at Jabbok is not a metaphor for a bad week or a hard season or a stretch of deconstruction that you'll eventually get through and look back with tidy clarity. It's a metaphor for the long, real, unglamorous work of becoming someone that the false names can't hold anymore. And that work takes as long as it takes. I wish there was a shortcut at the river, but there's not. But even though there's not a shortcut, there's a presence in that dark night of your soul. There's a question that sounds like an invitation. And friend, there is, on the other side of the crossing, a name that fits. The God in this story doesn't show up after you've done all the work and gotten yourself sorted out. The God of the Bible shows up in the middle of it, before the crossing, in the dark, before the dawn breaks, while you still are in the struggle. That's the promise underneath all of this. Not that all the grief will lift you if you believe hard enough, or that the confusion will resolve itself if you pray correctly. But the staying, but that staying present, right? Staying present and honest and grieving, refusing the easy answer, not leaving the river side before the blessing comes, might be exactly the posture that opens you to what's next. So thank you for being here with us today. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who's been carrying a name that was never really theirs. Not as a pitch, not as something slick to make them confused or join something, but just as a quiet, hey, you're not alone in this. You can find Mission Gathering online and in person. All the links are in the show notes. And thanks this week, if you can, just notice. Notice the names that activate and where they came from, and try on a truer one. Just for a day. See how it sits as we continue to rise up together. See you next week.